It's the Get Foxy Show. Today's guest, Dr. William Pawluck. Dr. William, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. You've got an absolutely fascinating expertise on PEMFs.
I do.
So right off the bat, what the heck is a PEMF? Or yes, a PEMF.
All right, well, probably before we get going, if people want to listen and walk away a little bit, they can as well. Then they go to drpawluck.com. That's drpawluk.com. And there's a ton of information on that website about what PEMFs are. So the short version, basically, is magnetic field therapy has been around for a very long time. So PEMFs stands for Pulsed Electromagnetic Fields. And PEMF therapy is therapeutic approaches using magnetic fields. There are different kinds of magnetic fields. So obviously we can use, not obviously perhaps for everybody, but we could use fridge magnets to help with aches and pains. They don't work that well, but they can work. So for a tennis elbow or a sore knuckle or a little rash, a mosquito bite, you can actually put a fridge magnet on that, and it can actually be very helpful. So those are called static magnetic fields. They're not moving. So once they're created, that magnetic field is just there. And then when you apply it to the body, the magnetic field interacts with everything that's going on in the body. Oh. Pulsed electromagnetic fields are called time-varied magnetic fields. So they are variable. Sort of like sound waves or flashing lights, same concept. So what you're doing is you're flashing or you're pushing a magnetic field through a wire. You're pushing current through a wire, which then produces a magnetic field. So any current flowing through a wire will produce a magnetic field. And that's why people have these concerns about power lines. So a magnetic field, a current flowing through a wire, let's say in the direction of my thumb. That's the current flowing that direction. Well, automatically, by laws of nature, you produce a magnetic field that's perpendicular to the flow of the current. And as that current pulses, like we know that we have 60 hertz pulsing in our power lines, so there's a lot more going on than that, but let's say it's 60 hertz. Then this magnetic field is going to be pulsing at 60 hertz. Now, the difference between pulse magnetic fields and EMF, so we'll get to that in a second, is that pulse magnetic fields stay within the loop of the wire. So they're what we call a closed loop. So as you pulse, it goes out, and then it collapses back down again. So that's called a closed loop. Pulse, back down, pulse, back down. Whereas, okay, let's go back to EMFs. So static magnets don't have any pulsing at all. They're just there. Okay, then we have the pulse magnetic fields, and then we have EMF. And EMF is broadcast into the environment, just like radio waves, just like television waves, just like radar is broadcast out into the environment. So essentially, that field can actually go to infinity, theoretically. Being broadcast, it's open loop, right? Which means it has wavelengths and you could do different things with it. So EMFs, for the most part, the ones that we worry about are, I call them environmental magnetic fields, even though it's electromagnetic fields.
Aha.
They're environmental magnetic fields. And they're very high frequency, typically. The ones that we are the most concerned about are cell phones, Wi-Fi, smart meters. All these things produce these Wi-Fi type signals that are basically microwave level frequencies. And a microwave level frequency is extraordinarily short. And because it's extraordinarily short, it gets absorbed by the body. And when it gets absorbed by the body, it creates heating, which is the purpose of microwave ovens, right? You're heating stuff because the microwaves are absorbed by that stuff, whether it's tissue or whether it's fluids, etc. And being absorbed by it, it heats it. Well, that's okay in a microwave oven, but is it okay in a human?
Well, I sure wouldn't think so.
There's lots of variability about what's important and what isn't important. The example that I use is if you hold the cell phone to your ear, if you hold it there long enough, your ear will turn fairly red, pretty red. If you look at the opposite ear, it's not so red. So what are you doing to that ear? You're cooking it. Now, it's not the same level of cooking as a microwave oven because it's not as powerful. And unless you're standing right next to a microwave tower, right in front of the microwave tower, you're getting jammed with a very powerful magnetic EMF. In that case, you can certainly get some significant heating going on in your body. If you have a 5G tower on your block, then you're going to be pretty close to a microwave tower or emitter. And that amount of density of exposure can eventually produce some harm in the body. So PEMFs are designed because they don't have long wavelengths. They don't have a wavelength, essentially, right? They just pulse out and they come back down again. But like microwaves, they can go through the body. But microwaves, because they're short wavelengths, don't go through the body. Whereas the PEMFs basically go up and through the body completely. And there are videos and there are other examples on drpawluck.com of how that happens. And so because PEMFs go through the body completely, they stimulate charge production in the body. So charge production is stimulating energy. And when you stimulate charge, so you can have charge going into the body by taking a current, like a TENS machine or other electrical stimulation applied to the skin, and you can hurt the skin. It hurts because you're applying current directly. So what you're doing is you're doing controlled electrocution.
Right? I'm with you there.
Right? That's harmful. It can be potentially helpful, but it's harmful. So TENS machines, for example, in my way of looking at them, are basically stomping on your toe when you have a headache. It's a distraction to the nervous system. But PEMFs, you'll feel them for the most part. You can have very strong magnetic fields that can actually cause muscles to contract. But usually those are just sort of like weird. My muscles just contracted. I have no control over it. But they're not painful. Now, if they are painful, then usually that means there's a problem in that muscle or in that joint or the tissue around where that contraction is happening. So we use that principle, in fact, at times. That becomes necessary to get the magnetic field deep enough into the body, strong enough into the body to create some muscle contraction and then a muscle relaxation. Muscle contraction, muscle relaxation. So PEMFs, for the most part, are designed to pass completely through the body. And as they pass through, they induce charge in the body by a law of physics called Faraday's law. So moving charges, moving currents, moving magnetic fields past currents, past charges, like ions, electrolytes. So what is our body? Our body is basically 85% electrolyte soup. We're a bag of soup inside skin. And even our skin is soup to some extent. But basically we're fluid, but it's electrolyte fluid, which means it's got ions, which means it's interactive, it has charges interacting within itself all the time. So for example, we have 100 trillion cells in our bodies, approximately. And every single cell has about 2,000 biochemical processes per second. All of that's happening just extraordinarily rapidly, as you can imagine, 2,000 processes per second. And those processes are controlled by charge. They're controlled by negative charge and positive charge on the molecules. And because it's charged, magnetic fields, as it passes through charge, activates the charge. And as a result, what you're doing is you're producing energy in the body. So if you have problems in the body that are stuck, that don't have enough charge, then all of a sudden they become activated and healing begins to happen.
Out of curiosity, Dr. Pawluck, what kind of problems are you talking about as far as problems being stuck?
Well, one of the FDA approved devices, which had been approved about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, was approved for healing fractures that won't heal. So those are called non-unions. So a fracture that doesn't heal within 6 months is considered to be a non-union. A non-union means it hasn't knit, hasn't united. And so that's a disaster because now you have a bone that's not functional. Now you basically almost have a joint where you shouldn't have a joint. And so that's a disaster. So these magnetic fields were approved by the FDA to stimulate fractures that stalled in their healing process. Now that doesn't happen that often. It happens maybe 1 or 2% of the time, depending on the fracture, the person, and so on. Well, as I said, it's a disaster. So all kinds of instrumentation approaches have been used to try to heal these fractures, but they create all kinds of problems. what was discovered at NYU, in fact, magnetic fields pulsing through the fracture site wakes everything up. You get circulation going, you get stem cells going, you get regeneration happening, you get fluid reduction, edema, swelling reduction, you get pain reduction. Basically, it's stimulating the healing process. That process got stuck in the first place because the body that had that fracture did not have enough energy to finish the job of healing it.
Okay.
And so the magnetic fields then just supplied the energy.
Now you're speaking some of my language as an acupuncturist. Because we talk about that energy being chi would be the word for it, but that energy not being able to energize the tissue enough to the point where the healing takes place. And so through acupuncture manipulation, we stimulate that energetic function of the tissue.
In fact, I'm trained in acupuncture myself.
Oh, no kidding. Cool.
As a medical doctor, I went through a program for doctors at UCLA. And I started my journey with magnetic field therapy as an acupuncturist. So that was in 1990, when acupuncture was basically like this. Don't come near me with those needles, right? It was unknown. And so I started looking for ways of doing acupuncture stimulation without using needles. And what I discovered is that in the Orient, right, they use magnets on acupuncture points to stimulate needles. And I use magnets extensively on ear points, on hand points, even on body points. And I found that they worked as well, or in many cases, even better than acupuncture, because what acupuncture doesn't do that much locally is to actually heal tissue. It doesn't stimulate the healing process. It provides energy in the body that moves energy, the chi, as you said, that moves energy to rebalance things. But it doesn't work well enough locally in the tissue. Whereas the magnetic field, as it passes through, it's not only stimulating the acupuncture point meridian, it's also stimulating the healing processes in the tissues. So you're getting dual benefits. And qi is the old sort of Chinese way of explaining energy flows, right?
Yes.
Well, there are probably other things going on as well, but we do know that the acupuncture points and meridian system are actually DC current systems. There's DC current flowing through that system. And it's what we call a lossless system. So it's all the meridians are connected, right? There are non-meridian points, but they're connected in other ways, but the meridian system is all connected. And so the energy flows through a 24-hour cycle through that whole system, but it's very low level, very low intensity, but it's flowing constantly. And where it stops flowing, then you have breakdown in the tissue, because then the tissue doesn't have the energy to finish the job of maintaining itself. So magnetic fields actually do acupuncture too. That's one of the first principles I discovered of magnetic field therapy, is it does acupuncture as well.
That's cool. That to me right there, I'm going, oh, that's fantastic. And I will admit too that I also make use of magnets in my practice. Not probably near as much as you do. So I may need to learn a little bit more about this from you, honestly.
Well, in fact, I have a course. We have a website called the PEMF Training Academy. And there's a course in there that I did an 6-hour training course for acupuncturists on how to use magnetic therapy in the acupuncture setting.
That's fantastic.
Those of you who are listening who might be interested in that might find that useful. And
what kind of resources do you have for lay folks, Dr. Pawluck?
Well, obviously, there's several. One is clearly the website, which is accessible to anybody, anytime. And there's a huge amount of information on the website. And I have 2 books that I've written that are very useful for people. The first book that I wrote is called Power Tools for Health. And that book has about 500 scientific references. So it provides some of the basic support and science behind magnetic field therapy and what it does and how it works. So there's a review of about 25 different mechanisms of action of magnetic fields, all the different things they do in the body. And also a review about 50 different health conditions, or let's say diseases. And I provide evidence for how magnetic field therapy works for those diseases. So that book is not as practical. It's still very useful. And if you want the science behind it, if you want to understand the concepts better, and have support of the science. For example, in a practice setting, doctors will often have it on their waiting room table, because then patients could look through it and say, aha, this is not voodoo, right? We still have problems explaining what acupuncture does, but this is not voodoo. It's supported by science, so it's very valid and very useful. The other book, which is one of the reasons that it prompted this interview, is called Supercharge Your Health with PEMF Therapy. And we'll provide you links for your show notes for that. So Supercharge Your Health with PEMF Therapy is a much more practical book. It goes into, I provide protocols. So how do you decide whether you should have a strong magnetic field or a weak magnetic field, or whether a whole body magnetic field or a local magnetic field? Those are decisions that the people have to make. At our drpawluck.com, we have a product comparison page. You can go look through all the different magnetic devices that I've used and I've tried and I recommend for people. You just have to know which one you need for your particular issues. So that gives you an explanation, but that becomes confusing. Even with that, it's still confusing. And one of the reasons that it may be a bit more confusing on the website is I have to be very careful what I say. As we all know, right? You can't make claims. So then the reason for the book, then the Supercharge Your Health book, is to give people more direct guidance on what would be the best device for their particular needs.
Do you end up having a fair amount of trouble with the FDA?
No, because I kept myself clean. On drpawluck.com, I don't make claims for any particular device. I talk about diseases and I talk about conditions at the blogs, but I write a blog. For example, I'm finishing a blog right now on heart failure. When I write a blog, I provide all the scientific support that for magnetic field therapy to be effective for a particular condition. And there's references. So again, as a medical doctor with an academic background, I make sure that we have a basis behind thinking that magnetic field therapy can work for this particular problem. Now, a book, you can say whatever you want in a book.
That
right?
makes
sense.
sense.
So the book can get into more detail about specific conditions and how you use the magnetic fields for those conditions.
Now, doctor, I'm always curious about how people kind of get into the work and the expertise that they do. How exactly did you decide you wanted to study medicine and then fall into this study of electromagnetic fields?
Well, I got into medicine because I knew I wanted to help people. My father-in-law was a high thigh amputee in a farm accident. He lost his leg in a farm accident. And he often woke up in the middle of the night screaming, the post-traumatic stress kind of thing. So I said, I'm going to go into medicine. Now, within medicine, I still had a perspective that somehow there's a lot more going on than just medications and procedures and so on. There's a lot more to life, and there's a lot more to illness and how it happens and how it resolves and so on, and how people get sick. So I always had that in the back of my head. But going through the training process, going through practicing medicine, being a medical director for a big medical group, you'd go down that conventional road. And eventually I kept sort of feeling that this was not doing right for people. One day, or over a series of a few days, in fact, as a medical director for this group, we shared patients and we had to go to the hospital and we had to make rounds on people who were admitted to the hospital. We had a couple of people within a very short space of time got admitted for gastric bleeding. One of them almost died. And the cause of that gastric bleeding in both of those individuals was ibuprofen. Okay, gastric. So ibuprofen, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, including aspirin, irritate the stomach and people can bleed from it. In fact, recently, people withdrew their recommendations for use of aspirin in people over 65 for preventing stroke and heart attacks, because more people were being harmed by the aspirin than were being actually helped by the aspirin. So we know it's a problem. In fact, actually about 16,000 people a year now die every year from gastric bleeding from ibuprofen for their pain management. So then I realized that this is stupid medicine. This is insanity. Right? Expecting the same results or without any consequences, basically. And so I said, I have to learn something different, which is why I went studied acupuncture. So I have to find a new tool to help with pain rather than the drugs and the procedures and so on, and avoiding narcotics. And that's how I got into magnetic field therapy. And then that little journey with the little acupuncture points over acupuncture points and meridians expanded my horizon into magnetic fields in general. And what do they do? How do they work? And one of my first books was called Magnetic Field Therapy in Eastern Europe, a review of 30 years of research. So it's a research book. But that book provided me then with a basis for how magnetic fields work. And then it really kind of exploded from there. And devices became available from Europe, and started using devices, and it just sort of grew. And now it's basically my full-time preoccupation.
That is so fascinating. I think that's really cool. Boy, I could now I'm thinking, man, I could ask you all sorts of questions.
By all means.
Oh, one question that comes up, since you're familiar with Chinese medicine, is what would your opinion on, for example, qigong practice? Do you see the body having its own magnetic fields? And is that kind of what happens with qigong practice and external qi healing type stuff?
I actually wrote an ebook about PEMFs as energy medicine. So in looking at energy medicine, how do people define energy medicine? So qigong is energy medicine, but acupuncture is energy medicine. Healing touch, therapeutic touch is energy medicine. Anything that's projecting energy from the body is energy medicine. So in doing that review, one of the common factors is that all of these are based on the transfer of energy and the use of energy. Grounding, earthing, they're a form of energy medicine. Wearing a copper bracelet on a wrist is energy medicine. So why is a copper bracelet energy medicine? Because the copper ions interact with the ions in the perspiration under the bracelet, creating charge, which then stimulates the acupuncture points and meridians at the wrist. And then that cascades up into the rest of the body. But the problem with energy medicine in general is that it was developed at times when that's all we had. It was the human or the earth, right? And occasionally, I suppose somebody would stand and hold a rod up and try to attract some lightning, which is probably not such a great idea to be energized by, because you can't control that. So then basically energy medicine is unpredictable. It's unreliable. There are qigong masters who are a phenomenon, but they did a study, Elmer Green did a study with something called a voltage wall. And he brought in healers, well-known healers, and got them to project their energy at this voltage wall. And it was very, very unpredictable and very unreliable. Sometimes they were amazing. They were astounding. They could produce 1,000,000 volts. And they did EEGs on these individuals and found that the EEG would excite itself to a point where then the blast of energy would come out of the body. Unpredictable and unreliable. Now, because of PEMFs, we now have a physical modality that's controllable, that's predictable, that's reliable, that's got the amount of energy that you need for the problem you're trying to deal with. So you don't have to guess whether somebody's going to be able to do it, whether they're on at that moment or not, whether they're eaten properly that day, they slept properly the night before, they're hydrated properly, et cetera. And so there's a huge amount of variation from healer to healer, not only within the healer, but between healers, clearly. So magnetic fields basically take care of that variation significantly. And they do probably most of the same things that the healers are doing, except I'm going to grant you that chi may be a lot of other things. There's a quantum level to it, right? There is a spiritual level to it. There's a lot of other things going on. But at a physical level, it doesn't matter whether you're a snail or a dog, an elephant, a human, a horse, it doesn't matter. Magnetic field therapy is equally effective on all of those, and predictably.
Out of curiosity, what kind of conditions have you seen improve in your own practice using PEMFs?
Again, because there are about 25 different actions of magnetic fields. So the actions themselves determine the results. So one of the clear actions, as I mentioned with the bone healing, is you reduce swelling. So if you have a swamp, you can't grow a garden in a swamp. You have to clear the swelling for the tissue to begin healing itself. And the swelling itself puts pressure on the tissues, which then limits the blood supply to those tissues. So then you have limited blood supply. You can't bring in the factors and materials that the body has naturally to do healing work, to do regeneration. So stem cell production is one of those. Increasing circulation is one of those. Decreasing pain is another one. Antioxidant support, reducing inflammation in the body is huge. So if you do nothing but reduce inflammation, right, that's already a huge start to the effectiveness of PEMFs. So nitric oxide, stimulating collagen production, stimulating GAGs and hyaluronic acid for healing cartilage and joints and other tissues, stimulating the brain. So I could put a brain to sleep like that with magnetic fields. Or I can wake a brain up, just like completely wake a brain up right away with magnetic fields, instantly.
That's fascinating.
Right. So you do all these different things, and that's all in the book as well. Those 25 different actions. So when you take those actions, then you take the diseases. So let's take diabetes, for example. Why would magnetic field therapy be important in diabetes? The problem with diabetes is circulation. And there's something called AGEs, advanced glycation end products. They basically bind up tissue and make tissue stiffer. So then you have tissue breakdown. Tissue becomes compromised in its healing. You don't have the immune system working as well in diabetics. So you have a circulation problem, you have a healing problem, and obviously you have a glucose control problem. But the glucose control problem is usually due to the fact that they are taking too much glucose. So you have to control that separately. Magnetic field therapy is not going to help a body like those fractures that I mentioned. It's not going to help a body that's depleted. You can't build a house without bricks and mortar. You have to have the resources for the body to be able to do the healing work it needs to do. So if you're going to heal bone, you have to have the minerals. You have to have all the other natural stimulants that go along with making bone. So you can stimulate the bone cells, the stem cells, to make a new bone, but you need the minerals to mineralize the bone that you've made, because otherwise it's going to be soft and jelly. You have to harden it. So magnetic fields stimulate that whole process from beginning to end. But you still need the basic tools in the tissues to be able to do the work the tissues need.
So nutrition's definitely important.
Absolutely critical. Nutrition and hydration. You still need to do all those things that lifestyle requires. You still need to have proper rest. You still need to have proper attitudes. You still need to have hydration. You still, again, have to have the proper nutrients. If you're pouring gasoline on the fire, then you want the magnetic fields to put out the fire. You have to have a situation of being able to know how much magnetic field therapy you need for the amount of fuel you're throwing on the fire at the same time. So you have to remove the stuff that's clearly making the problem worse by itself or generating the problem in the first place.
Now, do you see people just within your local area, or do you work with folks online, or how does that work?
So I'm no longer practicing. I retired about a year ago. I did holistic medicine for about 15 years and family medicine for 45 years. So now basically all I do is work with magnetic fields, and we provide people consultations. So we have a team of people here who know all about magnetic fields that I've taught.
Beautiful.
And so people call us and we will advise them on the right magnetic field device for them. If we have more serious problems, I'm not going to spend my time telling somebody about buying a $25 magnet. Just go to your fridge and get your own magnet. Right? You don't need my help for that. If you need my help for that, then you better have read my website. You better have read my books. If you've done all that, then you're going to be very, very well educated. So a lot of people surprisingly just won't even do all that basic stuff. So tell me what I need. All right, but then you better be ready for me to tell you that you need a $4,000 or $5,000 machine. If you're not ready to make that kind of investment in your health, because now you're talking about an investment. You're not talking about stuff you're using temporarily. You're talking about something you're going to be able to use for all the different things that magnetic fields do for yourself and family members and household members, including dogs and cats, and for the rest of your life. So what we're trying to do is to educate people to be basically self-caring. They will take care of themselves. And that's what magnetic fields allow you to do.
That's beautiful. We're going to have the links to your book. And I believe I've got links for 80 conditions treated with PEMFs.
Correct.
And then I was also given a link specifically if the listener wants a consultation with your team. I've got that link as well, and those will all be in the show notes.
Perfect.
So I've got one last question I'm going to ask you, Doc. And that's the question I ask all my guests. And that is, what does Foxy and being Foxy mean to you?
Oh, that's so much. There's so many layers to that. Well, I have foxes in my backyard, right? So you can think about Foxy in terms of sensuality and sexuality, that level of foxiness. To me, on a practical basis, I really admire foxes. They're ingenious. They will, like if you have a chicken coop, they will survey that chicken coop to find out how best to access it, because they have to feed themselves, right? We all do. And so foxes basically mean ingenuity, resourcefulness, determination, sticking to the task and the job. But you also have to know when you back off. You know, when you're not going to be able to take down that deer all by yourself, right? So in a sense, functionally speaking, that's what I consider Foxy to be. And magnetic fields from that perspective are absolutely Foxy.
Amen to that.
And they're doing things in your body that you have no awareness of what they're doing. Let me give you an example of that, to go back to that point. Since you have 100 trillion cells in your body, how many cells does it take for you? How many cells have to be damaged before you will even notice that you have a hangnail?
Well, it's got to be several thousand.
Millions.
Millions.
Millions. So millions of cells have to be damaged in a small toe. How many cells in a small toe? Millions, tens of millions. So for you to notice it, that means the level of talking to the body has to raise itself to a point that the brain says, oh, there's something going on down there. So it has to rise to the level of awareness. Enough noise has to be going on in those cells that the body becomes aware. So by the time the body becomes aware, a lot of damage has already been done. And when you start treatment, then basically you're quieting everything down. But again, once you are no longer aware of it, that doesn't mean the job is done, because you still have to back up all the way to where the damage began in those cells and tissues. Whether it was a bump on a tabletop or a corner of a table in the yard, or whether it was dropping something on your toe, or whether it was your overindulgence the night before Thanksgiving with all the add-ons, the carbs, etc. Or it's your gout acting up. Something caused it to flare up to a point where now you noticed it. Well, now you have to reverse it all the way back. If you stop treatment too soon, this is why personal treatment on a daily basis is critical to anti-aging. You have to stop it early, because if you wait until you now know that there's a problem, it's way down the road already.
Yes, indeed. Self-care is so important. And I think that's what makes this really cool about being able to use magnets in a way that, that's so inexpensive as far as daily self-care goes. So this is something that anybody can do, as far as I can tell. And
Yep.
it's widely accessible. So this is good stuff.
Treatment at home is critical to the best results. So going to get treatment somewhere else can be very effective for short-term needs, for a short-term problem, where you only need a few treatments. But then what do you do ongoing? So you have to think of your whole body, not just the problem you're experiencing right now. And that's why magnets, again, are preventative, because they're going to take care of business before it becomes business.
Well, there we go. Well, listeners, definitely check out Dr. Pawluck's website. We'll have the links on the show notes. Check out his book. We'll have the links there too. And if you'd like a consultation with his team, we'll have that link there too. Dr. Pawluck, thank you so much for taking the time today. This has been so informative, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you, likewise. And I wish you all the best in your magnetic work and your tribe and helping people to get better and stay better.